There has been a brewing diplomatic storm between South Africa and the United States, two nations with a long and complex history of engagement. The recent controversies followed by alleged land confiscation, allegations of arms shipments to Russia, South Africa's stance on global conflicts, notably what's happening in the Middle East as well as in Ukraine, South Africa's stance and the U.S. response with trade threats has raised questions about the future of U.S.-Africa relations. These tensions come a few days to the African Union elections 2025. As Washington increasingly seeks to counterbalance China's growing influence on the African continent, how Africa portrays itself as a self-sufficient continent, and would it or this opportunity or rift that has just emerged on the African continent be an opportunity to redefine partnerships on its own terms? We will unpack the implications for trade, diplomacy and a larger geopolitical chessboard, and ask what lies ahead for the African continent as it navigates its role in a world of shifting alliances. Stay tuned for insights from our expert this day as we explore this critical issue shaping the future of global power dynamics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Talking Point. Stay with us. Hello Africa and the world, thank you immensely for always honoring the rendezvous over your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. This is Talking Point once again, and today in the course of today's edition we focus on US-Africa's relation in the course of recent tensions between South Africa and the United States following the freezing of aid to the African continent by the Trump administration. It's worth noting that this has sparked a new phase of conversations across Africa. Africa is indeed self-sufficient, but it is time for the African continent to take its stance and of course redefine its position on the global stage for it to be able to renegotiate some of the partnerships it has with foreign allies. And today we shall be discussing this with our guest this day. And first of all, we're being joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist, an economist and the CEO of FINTECH. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us once again.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me. Thank those who are watching us on their platforms and on the channels you guys have via satellite as well.
Thank you so much for always honoring our invitation. Now, to kickstart, without further ado, today's conversation, Dr. FONGOD, you followed what's happening in South Africa with the tensions that are simmering between South Africa and the United States. And just a few days ago, we saw President Matamela Ramaphosa was stating that his nation would not be bullied on no account. Following these tensions and what's happening on the African continent, we're seeing a new trend where Africans are gradually becoming more and more conscious of what's happening within the continent, and they are redefining their partnership deals as well as cooperations with other foreign partners. With this said, looking at relations with South Africa, what are the root causes of this current diplomatic tensions we're seeing between South Africa and the US? And of course, how did this escalate up to this point where we're seeing not just aid freeze, but it's going beyond the nation's stance at the level of global politics?
Well, look, I think there's a long history in relationship to what is happening in South Africa, especially when it comes to land. This has everything to do with land. There are white South Africans, Afrikaners, who, are in control of large, quantity of land, and most of them are farmers, so they use this for agricultural purposes. The issue is that there's a gross disparity between Africans, black Africans in South Africa and white South Africans so far as land ownership is concerned. We had this in Zimbabwe, which basically resulted with sanctions that wiped out the whole entire country, especially in economic terms, and basically brought the kind of inflation in Zimbabwe that has not been seen anywhere else in the world. And so we're talking about the kind of impact that you don't wish on any country. South Africa is at the crossroads. I think that this is a missed opportunity, not now, but what was supposed to have been done, especially in the days of Nelson Mandela. I think that Nelson Mandela should have addressed this issue because the nation was ripe. The nation has just come out of the apartheid regime. The nation was coming together, and one of the concessions that should have been made should have been on the issues of land. That was left undone, hoping that somebody else will come to power and do that. I think that the only person who could have done this successfully would have been Nelson Mandela, because he was well respected, just coming out of prison, and the sentiments, even within white South Africans, was there for the support of whatever could bring about this rainbow nation, which is also supposed to be a cohesion of the different factions we have in South Africa, especially among the whites and the blacks. Unfortunately, that was not done in the Nelson Mandela regime. So now we are dealing with, somewhat a very frail, not that strong South African president, Ramaphosa, who has to do whatever it takes because of the pressure that is coming in, especially from the black elites in South Africa on the issues of land. The reality is that South Africa has to solve this issue, but I do not also think that it's just a matter of yanking that land from people without any genuine compensation. I think that the country is rich enough to be able to compensate those whose lands is being taken from. And secondly, it's just to be said what will be done with the lands that are being taken from those who genuinely have the skill set to be able to farm.
Thank you so much for insights, elaborating on that very much question. But then we've seen these tensions, and I mentioned in the previous question that this could span across South Africa's stance with the rest of the world. We have seen its stance as far as the Middle East crisis is concerned. We saw its neutrality in the Ukraine crisis. And as it stands, South Africa is one of those countries, for instance, come this year, is going to be hosting the G20 summit. With all this all this numerous happenings that's taking place revolving around the African nation, could these tensions surfacing at this particular point in time, be because they are at one point conflicting with some of the interests of the Trump administration?
Well, by the way, the notion that South Africa was neutral within the Russia and Ukraine issue, that in itself, it's not really what happened. I think that South Africa was on the side of Russia. It was just too obvious for them to come out and state that they're on the side of Russia. They're part of the BRICS nation, obviously. There's that sentiment in that direction. And secondly, South Africa basically came out, took Israel to the International Court, which is one of the things that actually pissed off the Trump administration because of the unwavering support for Israel. And so what I'm saying is this, that South Africa, it has no right, to do things that is in antithesis to what is it that we want so far as the continent of Africa is concerned. South Africa is supporting Palestine, which is good. I don't think that there's anything wrong in that, all right? But to sue Israel in the international courts, that begs, it brings me to a place of real confusion. And the reason is because we have black Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, that are being sold as sheep, sold as cattle, sold as goats, all right, in places like Libya, which is basically no man's land in the Sahara by Arab Muslims. And I don't see that sentiment coming in from South Africa, to be able to hold those guys not responsible, or to hold those people who basically maintain the terrorist organizations that is roaming free in the Sahara responsible. Countries like Yemen, countries like Qatar, countries like Saudi Arabia, we don't see any of that stuff. So I think that this is just a political stunt that is quite stupid, to say the least, and we have better issues on the continent of Africa to tackle, and we should start asking questions as why is South Africa basically controlling some mines in the DRC. We should be able to talk about those conversations rather than trying to have these smoke screens that means nothing. America has the right to choose who she spends her money with and how much she spends her money with. That is her responsibility. So we need to start thinking about Africa's first. I think we have pushed this whole entire agenda on this network about the idea that we need to have Africa's first. We need to start talking about how we on the African continent can take care of our continent, not relying on foreign aid from countries around the world. I think that if we don't think about Africa's first, believe me, situations like this will persist, and the only loser will be the African.
Indeed, the loser will be the African. Let's revisit in history. Back in history, in 1955 to be precise, we saw the adoption of the Freedom Charter in South Africa that showed that all Africans or all South Africans were equal before the law, be it in terms of land appropriation and otherwise. Now, looking at the African continent, I would like to transition that to the African continent, present-day Africa. You spoke about Africa first. Can we revisit some of these, key ideals that actually were, strongholds in the past to make Africa great again? Because we can be talking about Africa first, but yet we ask ourselves the question, with this call by numerous African leaders, with this call by numerous African, activists, I might put it that way, calling for the United States to change its decision about the foreign aid being sent to the African continent, don't you think it's actually time for Africa to reconsider its decision? And of course, it is high time for Africa to put the continent first, like you mentioned in your previous response.
If only we can be able to have this call to ask America to basically change, her mind, ask Trump, beg Trump, go on our knees and say, we hail you, Donald Trump, please help Africa because Africans are dying, help Africa because we will not have medications for HIV, those were the retroviral drugs, please help Africa because we are in dire situations, we need your help. The reality is that we should be help. We should actually push this, to the Africans, those who are in leadership, the presidents we have elected on the continent of Africa that are, just useless to the continent. If they can be able to look at the continent of Africa the way the continent is supposed to be looked at, we will not be begging anybody for anything. We have enough resources on the continent of Africa to live the way we're supposed to live and to have all the healthcare infrastructures that we need on the continent of Africa to improve on our human development index, which is basically how you measure how people feel, life expectancy, whether people have access to hospitals or not. That's how we improve on that sector. But no, we don't have that kind of leadership on the continent of Africa. So once, foreign aid, it's as if to say the GDP of most African nations is dependent upon foreign aid. Once foreign aid is cut off, all right, like we've seen now with the Trump administration, everybody is going crazy, which tells me that those we elect into office comes into office with no vision whatsoever to be able to get us out of poverty. All right, they are only trying to get foreign aid so they can be able to lace their pockets with all kinds of money they have stolen, all right, and take the money out and still save them in Swiss banks and God knows what. We must fight this battle, with conviction, knowing mindfully well that the liberation of the continent of Africa has to be with Africans, with us. And the reality is this: I'm growing weary with any kind of expectation that leadership on the continent of Africa will be able to help Africa. The reality is that the change must come from the grassroots, and the change must come from the people on the streets of Africa who will rise up to topple, this infrastructure that stands as a Tower of Babel, to use biblical terminology, in antithesis with progress.
Now, Dr. FONGOD, now let's look at the economic aspect, of some of the implications of these tensions existing between South Africa and the United States. You're an economist as well, and let's divert. Now, South Africa happens to be, part of the AGOA, which is the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Now, it involves numerous countries, and I recall numerous countries on the African continent, notably Uganda and a host of others, have been suspended from this group or initiative due to reasons that they don't align with some of the policies of the group. Having said that, some of that wouldn't go into details in citing some of the numerous, breaching policies. But when you look at the implications, what are some of the implications from an economist point of view? What are some of the implications of these tensions ongoing between South Africa and the U.S. in its participation in terms of trade agreements with AGOA? And how does this pan across its relations with other Western allies?
AGOA is a scam. From an economic perspective, so far as I'm concerned, it makes no sense to the African. All right, this stuff enacted in the year 2000, I think, which is the African Growth and Opportunity Act. That in itself means nothing. If you look at what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa, we do not even have the capacity to be able to feed ourselves. So what kind of trade agreements are we talking about so far as the West is concerned? And whatever the West do ship to us on the continent of Africa, most of those things that is being shipped actually comes in at lower prices than goods that are being farmed or produce being farmed on the continent of Africa. And the reason for that is because Western farmers are heavily subsidized. So there is absolutely no real leverage and competition. So the African farmer, it's always going to be as as a disadvantage as opposed to the Western farmer. First of all, the Western farmer is heavily mechanized, the African farmer is not. So that in itself does not bring about any kind of meaningful trade so far as AGOA is concerned. So far as I'm concerned, I think that we should do more. Why don't we focus on finding ways to, first of all, feed ourselves, forget about all of this stuff, and then make sure that whatever is being shipped into the continent of Africa is heavily taxed. We should talk about tariffs like nobody has ever seen tariffs before. And the reason for that is because, after all, most of whatever is being shipped into the African continent is finished goods. We are the one exporting the raw materials. Maybe someone on the continent will start thinking twice about us industrializing, having industries, going into manufacturing so that we can begin to convert some of these raw materials into finished goods. We need that. We need a hard reset. We must start from somewhere. I suggest we start now. We start today. We can push this stuff forward. I think that 10 years is enough time. 20 years is enough time for us to begin to get back at full production, where we absolutely deliver ourselves from this economic strain that is coming from the West and especially from China.
Now, I'll be picking up from where you stopped, in line with what you said, Dr. FONGOD. Now, you mentioned agriculture. Agriculture is often said and quoted as the backbone of every society. With that said, do you believe that investing in agriculture and energy on the African continent could go a long way in, or not just energy, in STEM, for instance, could go a long way in reverting some of the repercussions of ruptured relations with foreign partners on the African continent, thereby putting Africa first, which is one of your philosophies?
Well, obviously, look, I think that energy is key. If you saw what happened in Nigeria recently with the high levels of inflation, which, it's actually gone down significantly. But those high levels of inflation came primarily as a result of, forecasity, which resulted in price hikes at the pump. The moment the prices of energy basically goes up, everything else is bound to go up. If we can be able to take care of the issues of energy on the African continent, I guarantee you that the continent will begin to experience the kind of boom, the likes of which we have not seen before. And the reason for that is because then most areas on the continent of Africa will be ripe for us to be able to get into the areas of industrialization and manufacturing. Energy is absolutely needed for us to be able to achieve this feat. Secondly, I think that if we basically also brings about energy, royal electrification, and high penetration of electricity into inner cities, into in villages in the inner part of the continent of Africa will really help us get young people on the continent of Africa to get into some kind of education where people can begin to learn by e-learning platforms rather than having traditional schools, which is very scarce in most rural parts of Africa. We need to be able to get young people to be educated, especially in the areas of science, engineering, and technology. We need to be able to get folks who are, trained to be able to meet up with the job market, especially in the 21st century, and have the capacity to work wherever it is that they live, as long as there's power and there's high penetration of internet services. I think that those are the things that we need to do. In the front of agriculture, there is no way in which we can talk about food scarcity on the continent of Africa and it makes sense to anybody who even lives on the continent of Africa. The reason is because 60% of the world arable land that is good for agriculture, is actually present on the continent of Africa. Chinese and firms from China are buying up lands in Northeast Africa, all right, to farm all kinds of stuff out there. And yet the only person who is not interested in land on the continent of Africa are the Africans and the Africans in the diaspora. There is nothing as disheartening as to see, the land grab that is taking place on the continent of Africa. I think time has come for us to be able to look deeply as to what is going on. When we see Ramaphosa in South Africa redistributing land, we need to start telling ourselves, why you're redistributing land to white, from taking it from white South Africans and giving it to whoever you want to give the land to. I want you to also understand that on the continent of Africa, Chinese are buying up everything. All right. So that tells you a little bit more as to where our priorities lie. We need to be good stewards of the continent.
Good stewards for the continent, indeed. And of course, looking at the African continent, do you believe that, investing in trade between African countries, cooperation between African countries will go a long way, in putting Africa first and, of course, making the African continent an economic giant to stand where it's supposed to be and, of course, face the rest of the world?
Yes, obviously. Look, there's I think that the only good initiative that ever came out of the dying AU, it's the free trade, the free trade, continental free trade area, which in itself, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just a good idea, and I think that. Well, just like I said, I think it's a good idea. I don't think that it's made any significant progress, no matter how you look at it. So the AU, so far as I'm concerned, is dying. There's no reason why anybody should resuscitate it. I think that what it needs is a mortuary. It does not need a hospital. The EU, if somebody was going to ask me, they should send their condolences, write their cards and send their best wishes to whoever they want to, because the reality is that organization is dead. The OAU died they gave us the AU, and the AU has the same problems the OAU had. So there's no reason why we shouldn't kill this one. I think that this should die, and we have to find something that makes sense to take over. The continent of Africa needs to have open borders within the continent of Africa. There is no reason why anybody on the continent of Africa needs a visa to go anywhere. First of all, we are restricted on the continent of Africa because we do not have the road network or the infrastructure for travel on the continent of Africa to allow us to move goods and services across the continent. That is the first limitations that we're having. We need to be able to overcome that limitation. And secondly, there is no reason why an African who is situated in the so-called Ghana, all right, and an African who is somewhere located in the place like Goma in the DRC should not be able to travel within the continent freely. There's no reason why we need visa to go anywhere as Africans on the continent of Africa. That should stop. We keep talking about it, and this is the most frustrating aspect of these conversations that we have, is that we keep talking about these things, and then you ask yourself, what is going on? And that is the simple reason why I'm pushing officially, that the AU should be dissolved, all right? We have something else that we think will basically, stand in its place, but we need to dissolve the EU and get people with a little bit of spine, will, determination, Afrocentric nature, Afrocentric in nature, have the love for the continent of Africa, have the love for our ancestors, have the love for the future of our children, to be able to do something so drastic so that we can be able to give the kind of continent we want, to the future generation, and at least be remembered for something other than looting, other than embezzling, other than carrying every single thing else that we can so far as the continent is concerned to feed ourselves and our cronies, and take the money to live large abroad. Meanwhile, everyone else is dying on the continent of Africa. I think time has come for us to be able to show a little bit of humanity, at least. There's an expression that says charity begins at home. Let that charity start in Accra, let it start in Goma, let it start in Soweto, let it start in places like Yaoundé.
Well, we're advocating for, Africans to be united, Africans to walk one hand in hand. From your perspective, like you mentioned, the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, is yet to get into full force on the African continent, though it is a great initiative. We're just a few days away from the African Union elections that's supposed to take place this February in Ethiopia. And of course, there shall be a new president or chairperson that might emerge from that said summit or said meeting that's supposed to take place in Ethiopia. With that said, amidst all the stakes, especially the calls for Africa to be more united, Africa to have a common currency, Africa to have a common passport, Africa to have maybe a language that could, facilitate communication from region to region, why not, with all the stakes, what is needed? Let's focus on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. What is needed for these great initiatives, like you mentioned, to get into full force on the African continent, despite the outcomes of whatever the elections will hold in Ethiopia in a few days from now?
Well, the elections in Ethiopia is meaningless, it's useless, it means nothing. The infrastructure of the EU is rotting from the core, right?
Yes.
It's rotten from the core, so it doesn't really mean anything. What matters for me is this, that there has to be concerted effort among African nations. Maybe we go block by block, a block like ECOWAS or SADC. We just look at ECOWAS, for example. If ECOWAS has any kind of will, we should be able to create our own free trade area among West African member states where we trade freely. What that means points is this, that we need to basically build the infrastructure to allow for the trade. If you're going to move goods and services across large vast of land like what West Africa holds, you need to be able to do one thing: build the road infrastructures, railway lines that will be able to transport goods and services across these countries. Cocoa farming in places like Ghana and Ivory Coast, it does very well. Nigeria has a large chocolate, market, and they are producing a lot of chocolate in Nigeria, but they don't just have, a lot of cocoa beans in Nigeria. So if we can be able to have the infrastructures to ship those cocoa beans from places like Ghana and bring it into places like Nigeria, where the expertise for conversion is already there, maybe we can also be able to boom up the market for chocolate in Nigeria, while also booming, farmers in places like Ivory Coast and in places like Ghana. So these are the issues that we need to be able to handle, so far as helping open up free trade across the continent of Africa. I don't think that there's the will, especially among many African nations, and I think that this has to do with whatever form of deceptive contracts that they have signed with foreign organizations that is impeding this real progress on the continent of Africa. I have mentioned before that if you look at a country like Ivory Coast, that produces about 30% of all the world's cocoa. All right, 30%. All right, she is the boss, but her GDP, per capita, is small as compared to a little tiny known community in the state of Pennsylvania called Hershey. Well, chocolate is being produced in America. Hershey, Pennsylvania does not have one cocoa plant. All right, it's a community that feeds up with snow and God knows what. I used to live out that way, and so they rely heavily from cocoa coming from Southern America and from Africa. But the question becomes, they tell us how much they're going to buy. What is it that we farm on the continent of Africa? That's some real power. So we can change that. And the only way we can change that is by getting into manufacturing itself and then making sure that we tell the world how much we're going to sell our cocoa. It doesn't matter how much tariffs they put to anything, they still need our cocoa. End of story. That's just the way it's going to happen. Unfortunately, we don't just have that will on the continent of Africa to do so, because we have leaders who are corrupt, corrupt, and everyone on the continent of Africa seems to be so corrupt. And the only person who does not understand the worth and the value of the African is the African.
Well, it will take Africa to be able to change the narrative. That's why we'll have conversations like this, to awake a consciousness across Africa. From a broader perspective, Dr. FONGOD, what does this part, this part between South Africa and the United States about, signal about the changing dynamics of U.S.-Africa relations and these in the increasing multipolar world? Because this question comes, or this conversation comes, amidst the recent changes we have seen in the global world. And of course, it's worth noting that more and more countries across Africa are gaining consciousness, not just consciousness that Africa is great, not just consciousness that Africa is a rich continent, but consciousness that Africa is a country that is a continent that is self-sufficient, and they're striving for their own independence. So how does this, this recent changes go a long way in, shaping Africa's stance as a whole?
I think we've talked about the fact that the continent of Africa needs to be able to take its page moving forward, or its marching orders from a speech Trump gave in his first administration. I think was around, I can't remember, between 2016 and 2018. Maybe 2018, I don't know. But he gave that at the United Nations. And what Donald Trump said was this. Donald Trump's speech was, about 5 sentences. America is great, Donald Trump said in quotes. America is great. America is powerful. America has the largest military. America is prospering. America is energy independent. And everyone was laughing. And then Donald Trump said, now go make your countries great. And everyone kept quiet. You see, the reality is that we need to begin to understand about how valuable what Donald Trump is doing right now to the consciousness of the African is. We have been given all kinds of perks that is laced with cyanide, poison. And I'm using that figuratively so far as how bad foreign aid has been on the continent of Africa. LGBT agendas has been placed on us, on the continent of Africa, which is in antithesis to our cultures, our values, our belief systems. But because we are collecting foreign aid, someone like the failed presidential candidate Harris, can show up on the continent of Africa and tell us on the continent of Africa what to do. And once you say, no, we're not going to do this, then they cut funding like they did with Uganda. So time has come for us to understand that real help is when we are able to help ourselves. Legitimate change is when the change is initiated from within, not without. That the capacity for the African to be able to deliver themselves out of the stalemate in which the African is in is when the African has the capacity to change from within. I think that Africa needs to rise. I think that we need to change. And the only way I think we will change is when people like Donald Trump basically says to the African, well, we have been spending too much money on you and we don't think we should be spending any money on you. Why don't you just fix your own money? Why don't you just fix your own stuff? It's good. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because that just simply means whatever stuff we are now trading going forward will be at fair value. Which means we need to also now begin to examine all the mining expeditions that is taking place on the continent of Africa. We need to have conversations on crude oil. We need to have conversations on diamond. We need to have conversations on cobalt. We need to know with certainty who is in Goma. We need to be able to know which of these, mining expeditions that is taking place in the DRC is connected with corporations in America like Google, like Tesla, like Dell, all right, and in Microsoft. We need to know with certainty which of these corporations, which recently, as of 2018, got sued, for participating in child mining, all right, in the DRC. We need to know which of them is participating and then sue the living daylight out of them at the international court. And Pali will not go anywhere, but at least it will signal to the rest of the world that the African has just become conscious.
And speaking of consciousness, there is this philosophy many times we talk about on the African continent, that of Ubuntu, I am because you are, and you are because I am. Now, in line with that philosophy that has been reckoned across Africa, how can Africa, the African continent, capitalize on the meaning of this philosophy to direct the continent towards where it is supposed to be?
A few years ago, I had a friend who traveled to Ghana. She took her daughter to Ghana right from Los Angeles, and while she was in Ghana, she noticed something that was quite disturbing. She realized that the young local Ghanaian was far more courteous to the Caucasian than was to her that was Black, African. And so she began to wonder what really was the issue. There need to be a reset in the minds of the African. And that reset will be that whatever looks white does not necessarily mean good. That what is white is not superior. That what is white is not God. That what is white is not supposed to be worshipped. That what is white is just an offspring, an offshoot, a third generation of what is supposed to be, that whites came out of blacks. I think the continent must grapple with this level of consciousness, because we are delusioned on the continent of Africa when it comes to who we are as a people. Africans need to understand that the white race, white people, emerge out of the continent of Africa from blacks. Every human being in existence today is of the human species, Homo sapiens. There used to be a group called the Neanderthals that got extinct about 10,000 years ago. So everyone in existence today, whether you're Chinese, Hindu, Indian, it doesn't matter, you are Homo sapien. And Homo sapiens emerged out of Africa around the Great Lakes, all right, maybe 300 and something thousand years ago, maybe. But the notion that we can be able to be on the continent of Africa and look at white people to be far more superior and far more, wonderful, all right, that we are in awe of looking at white people, that is something I find very troubling. What that means is this: when an African sees another African, I want you to understand that you're looking at a king. When you look at another African, you're seeing a queen. You're seeing the originator, okay, of civilization. You're seeing the very first people who began writing. It began on the continent of Africa. There are caves in South Africa, all right, that dates to about 150,000 years old, with writings within those caves that indicates about art and culture, which was known to that part of the world 150,000 years ago by Black Africans. And this also goes to the whole entire land grab issue in South Africa, where white South Africans have this imagination that they came to that part of the land and there was nobody there except they don't know about Makabubwe. All right, Makabubwe in the Savannah Bushveld in South Africa, that was home to kings and queens in the highlands. And there were people that were known with gold and sculpture. So we need to be able to fully understand that the Black African is a king, she is a queen. And the spirit of Ubuntu is not just a celebration of who we are as a people. Ubuntu is a celebration of the consciousness of the African. It's a celebration of the depth, the gratitude we hold to the continent we call home. And it is within the confines of that level of joy and happiness we have when the chant of the African, especially in places like East Africa, or with the Maasai, with those, with the Ashantis, and with the peoples of the Cameroons, and you name it, it is with the African chant that is reminiscence not just of our cultural heritage, but the very soul and the fabric of the continent. So when I say Ubuntu is a religion, it is a pathway to the ancestors, because the reality is this: you are because I am, and I am because you are. Not just because it's a closed loop, but because it is more of a passage to where we are from. Importantly, but to where we can be, and that is where we are going to. If we cannot celebrate our past, we cannot embrace our future.
The spirit indeed. If Africa cannot, celebrate its past, it might be difficult for it to be able to decipher its own future, especially at the time when the African continent is at the crossroads of making a very decisive decision of where it intends to be. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point over For You Media Africa, where we decipher or discuss matters affecting or important to the African people. Back with you, Dr. Fongod. From where we stopped, you spoke about the philosophy of Ubuntu, how important it is for African people. With this growing tensions between U.S. and the United States, I would like to move away from the tensions in itself. Do you agree that these resentments that is growing at this point in time have opened new opportunities for constructive dialogue on the African continent? Not just any type of dialogue, but a dialogue that could chart the way forward for the African continent.
Absolutely. I think there's an expression that necessity is the mother of all invention. And now that the African has been told no money is coming, we have to start thinking about ways in which we can handle things by ourselves, right? Maybe we stop cutting and destroying, the forest that we have in places like Cameroon. Maybe we just stop exporting the timber and stop destroying our environment, because probably that's the only way we know how to make money. Maybe even if we have to cut, we start thinking about how to be able to plant. That is something, those are the conversations that we really need to be having on the continent of Africa. And thank God that this is happening, and America basically is saying what the US is saying underneath the Trump administration. I have absolutely no problems with America doing this. America does not owe Africa anything. Rather, Africa needs to be able to wake up and start treating the rest of the world as full equal partners. And secondly, making sure that we on the continent of Africa start creating this synergy on the continent, where what you're good at as a country and what I'm good at, we can now begin to partner and see how we can grow ourselves and then become all that we're supposed to be. Look at a place like DRC today, which is basically in turmoil. A place like Goma. You have Tutsis in Rwanda, you have Tutsis in Congo, you have Tutsis in Uganda, all right? And so you have the same people, okay, across 3 different countries or 4 different African countries, and you have to ask yourself the question, who and what is responsible for us still maintaining this de facto international borders that we have on the continent of Africa across the same people? So maybe once someone who is in Cameroon, all right, is talking to somebody in Central African Republic or somebody in Gabon, they should have the consciousness that they are talking to the same people. When the Bakais roam the equatorial rainforest in the Cameroon's area, and they go between Cameroon, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and Central African Republic, they don't know if they are crossing international boundaries. They know they are living in the forest because that forest has been home for them for more than 100,000 years. The reality is this: we must be able to take care of our own. We don't need any outside influence. We don't need to be coached. We don't need to, to be begged. The reality is we must do what is needful for the growth, all right, and for the prosperity of the continent. We must come together and come together now. I think this is an opportunity that we cannot miss. This is an opportunity that is good, and thank God for Donald Trump.
And speaking of which, we'd like to focus on the different strategies now this time around that Africa can, African nations can adopt in a bid to redefine, because it's one thing to cut away from the rest of the world, but in one way or the other, Africa can have, partnerships with, external parties on a mutual beneficial level. So with that said, how can Africa, what particular strategies can African nations adopt to ensure that they have relationships with global powers that are mutually beneficial? It's a win-win. It's not like we collect raw materials and at the end of the day you gain nothing but funds with highest interest. So what strategies could be implemented?
I think that the only strategy that is needed right now is that whoever is trying to do anything so far as Africa is concerned must start thinking about investments in Africa. What that means is this: we are not interested in shipping anything out. We are just interested in having machines for manufacturing on the continent. That is the only way we get to solve this issue and bring ourselves to a place of real sanity. It is going to be extremely quite difficult for us to start talking about doing any kind of real trade with the rest of the world, because there is no trade that we're going to offer. I mean, you either offer farm produce, which we are not capable, neither do we have the skill sets to be able to do any of that, or you're going to offer raw materials, which is basically in the form of mining, primarily, or timber and very few stuff, or maybe cocoa. So we have to compete, therefore, by making sure that we bring about industrialization on the continent of Africa. We just need to be able to partner with the rest of the world in relationship to machinery, and expertise in the areas that we need, maybe in mining, in agriculture, and whatever industries that we bring on the continent of Africa. Without which, we still can't compete in trade. So when we talk about trade, so far as Africa is concerned, it is really not trade. It is just a draining of our natural resources on the continent of Africa, plus cocoa, maybe.
I remember a statement made by the South African Minister of Mines, where he stated that it was time for Africa to stop exporting its mineral resources, to foreign nations, because at the end of the day, it only goes a long way in affecting negatively the African continent. Now, when we're looking at ways forward, what role does the diaspora, African diaspora that is abroad, play in ensuring that Africa is empowered to become the great continent that is often known as?
I think that we need to be able to do something like create organizations on the continent of Africa that will cater just for the Africans in the diaspora to serve two purposes. Number one, safe investments on the continent of Africa, and number two, recruiting those who really want to be able to invest on the continent of Africa from outside of the continent of Africa, which means whatever organization we set up should have some branches across the world, and also should have branches within the continent of Africa that will make sure that anyone who comes in from outside of the country, of the continent, to invest in Africa, their investments are safe, number one, and they also are talking to people who have been certified by these organizations to carry out whatever investments that they're trying to carry out. Reasons being, we don't want someone, goodwill, who basically wants to come and help out in Africa, being swindled with whatever resources that they come to Africa with. So that everyone who really wants to come to Africa knows that, their investments are safe. That's the first thing. Secondly, we also must be able to have a hard look at our practices when it comes to foreign direct investors on the continent of Africa, especially if they are blacks or Africans in the diaspora. We need to be able to make sure that the environment for them is absolutely favorable. For example, we must be able to cut all those taxes that we put in for those coming to invest into the continent. We must just basically stop all of those taxes to make sure that we give enough incentive, for folks to be able to come and invest without paying the penalty for doing so. We must create safe haven, all right, for investors who are of African origin. I'm talking about Africans in the diaspora, to come and invest on the continent of Africa. Ghana is doing well, especially as they begin to give a lot of citizenships to African Americans, and they are already doing a lot of investing in the country of Ghana, and Ghana is reaping some of the benefits as we speak. So we need to be able to make sure that we do that across the continent of Africa. But the the African in the diaspora will be key for the emancipation of the continent.
It's true that the African diaspora do have a role to play. Away from the diaspora, looking at Africa, you said it's imperative for the African continent to be able to, make the environment conducive for investments, no matter the form. But speaking of it being conducive, do you believe, or are you of the opinion that issues of insecurity in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, some parts of the Sahel, might be hindering these investments, which is so much needed on the African continent by Africans themselves?
Well, look, the Sahel has become a place of filled with mixed emotions, but I'm quite hopeful. And the reason for that is because, I think that good things are happening. Obviously, foreign direct investors will be very worried. Okay, investors are very worried when they have to come into a country that is leased with uncertainty. Everybody wants to know that if they get into a particular country, they will be able to get their money back. And so the notion of having a military leadership, which is basically not a democratic thing, basically scares a lot of investors. That being said, we also were in a situation where the democracies we had over there was not doing what it was supposed to do, especially for security, in the region, and also just by virtue of the level of poverty that the people were living in. If you remember, a country like Niger, was at the bottom of all human economic index, human development index. It was actually at the bottom of all of them worldwide. That was like the worst nation on planet Earth. But look at where they are now. And look at what is happening now after Bazoum got deposed. Look at what is happening with the nation now. It has become a beacon of hope. And I think that there's a lot to be said about, what is possible on the continent of Africa and where we can go and what should happen. I'm quite optimistic that if, I think that we should be able to embrace a lot of changes, especially within the countries that are not known for wars, maybe south of the Sahara, countries like Nigeria, countries like Ghana and Cameroon and the rest. I think that we must be able to open up the market and have investors come in and without all these fees, without all these restrictions. If we are able to do that, then I think that that's how we open up the continent for industrialization.
Okay, I have a couple of questions before we part ways on today's edition of Talking Points. But then, the United States, like many other foreign countries, do have military bases on the African continent. Sometimes they assist the country's military forces or troops in trying to combat or quell tensions, be it at the level of security. But with all this that's happening within the continent of Africa, we're seeing a rejuvenation of different sentiments across the African continent. We wouldn't cite, anti-French sentiments that have been, been re-echoing in the past months and even up to a year on the African continent, mostly in West Africa. Looking at Africa at this point, would this diplomatic rift go a long way in, bringing about a beginning of a long-term shift in the way Africa engages with the United States, being in terms of of security, in terms of trade, in terms of diplomacy and otherwise?
I think that there has to be a lot said, especially when you start talking about military bases. And I don't think that this is just an American thing. You have, you have, I think China, you have China, you have Russia, you have France, Japan, in one country in Djibouti alone. And so I don't really think that this is just one issue. There is this U.S. African Command, which it's called, I think it's AFRICOM, U.S. African Command, and they maintain these military bases across the continent of Africa. And the reality is this, that all of that is geopolitical control. And my point is, I don't think that any foreign country, especially Western country or Eastern country, and this includes China, should have any military base, no matter what, on the continent of Africa. If there will be any force anywhere on the continent of Africa, let it be African forces. And the reason why I say so is because this is one of the failures of the AU. Okay, so we need to be able to make sure that every base, every military base on the continent of Africa, it's gone. All of them, all foreign military bases on the continent of Africa, gone. We don't have issues in the Sahel, so far as, ISIS is concerned. We don't have those issues. Those issues came as a result of what happened in Libya. And I think that if Africa is willing, we can be able to take care of that particular issue and rid that cancer out of the Sahel, and we would never have that issue again. Likewise, Boko Haram. And so what we need really is to have a serious African force that is on the African continent, an African force that is made up of Africans, where we can be able to send people who are Africans to get in, to get into the middle of all of this crisis, undetected as spies and what God knows what, to be able to destabilize these structures which are quite foreign to the continent of Africa in the first place. We are talking about ISIS, we are talking about Boko Haram, we are talking about, Al-Qaeda in the Greater Maghreb. We need to be able to get these groups out of the continent of Africa, and we can do so as Africans. And I think that we have the capacity to be able to do so as Africans. See what is happening in the Sahel now. All right, they are doing what they can, and frankly speaking, we have not heard about fresh attacks in the Sahel since the juntas took over those three major nations: Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger.
Now we're gradually coming to the end. It's worth noting that the change is now. Time is now for Africa, to take the baton of command and, of course, move the African continent forward. Just to culminate to this conversation, Dr. FONGOD, in your capacity as a Pan-Africanist, what would you say is the way forward for Africa, moving past the repercussions of maybe the deteriorations it might have with foreign partners, but Africa taking the baton of command and, of course, championing or paddling its own continent?
A few days ago, I was on a TV channel somewhere in Nigeria, and one of my co-panelists, were three of us. One guy is a lawyer from the U.S. He's a Nigerian-born, U.S.-based attorney, and is also a professor at some university, and was also I think he's working with some African nation, especially within the context of the EU. When he heard I said that the EU should be dismantled, he took an offense with that. And he was like, no, you can't just come to the station or studio and say that. And I said, yes, I did. And this righteous indignation that we have so far as understanding what is needed for the continent of Africa always comes from men who are benefiting from the stalemate, who are benefiting from the issues that is happening on the continent. Doctors will shut you down when you start talking about a particular form of treatment that seems not to be working, or when you start talking about any kind of reform so far as the hospital sector is concerned, because you are absolutely going against the money that they're making. Likewise, lawyers so far as politics is concerned. My point is this: a time comes when we see the suffering of the African from an Afrocentric perspective, from a humanitarian perspective, and say to ourselves, this thing has failed and it has not served its purpose. This time, there's need for change. The problem we have on the continent is that when we talk about change, we always think that the change is for somebody else, is not for us. Change means you. Change means me. Change is us. That means each and every one of us must be able to embrace change. The only way we emerge from where we are, if it will become and become what we're supposed to be, will be if we change. If only we can change. That means we will dream more about what we have the capacity to do. We will be able to dream more about the future we want for our children, and we'll tell ourselves the status quo does not work. The reality is this: I see a bright future for the continent of Africa. I see a bright future for the continent, for our children. I see a bright future for the young generation and the future generation of Africans. The one thing I'm afraid of is the men who are in control now, the people in power. And this is what I'm saying to them. The reality is this: tomorrow's Africa will have to be in the hands of their own children also. The reality is, for us to be able to build up a legacy that is meaningful, we have to change. And the change will be to embrace tomorrow's Africa with the love and fortitude, knowing mindfully well that we cannot maintain the status quo and believe that something good will happen. We have to do whatever it takes now to be able to dream about a tomorrow. A tomorrow for young Africans who will not have the desire or not the ambition to fly out of the continent to look for greener pastures, but that children of Caucasians and Chinese and Asians will be able to fly to the continent of Africa to see this modern marvel we call home. That is the dream I have.
Free African, thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your brilliant insight on today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for inviting me.
It's always a pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we shall be coming to the end of today's edition of Talking Point. Have in mind that the future of Africa is great, but it will take you and I for us to make Africa great like the forefathers had envisioned. Ladies and gentlemen, while we say we have come to the end of today's edition of Talking Point, do stay in company of our numerous programs only on your Pan-African channel, For You Media Africa. Bye-bye.